So welcome to episode 79 of Silver Lining for Learning. And we're excited because this is our first episode that really deals with philanthropy. And we'll be talking about human-centered education, philanthropy, and systems change, all of which are near and dear to our hearts, with people who are really engaged in transformative models, which is also near and dear to our hearts. So before I introduce them, I just want to thank Fiona Young, who published a blog post on SLL about a year ago and has published an update to that blog post. So I hope that those of you watching will take a look at her ideas and thoughts. So Ulcca Hansen is from Grantmakers for Education, which is a great group. And actually, they're having a conference this weekend, and Ulcca gets a special Purple Heart for joining us when she's running a conference. And Nora Flood and Charles Dukes are with the Wend Collective, which is one of the Walmart philanthropies, but has a very unusual approach to philanthropy that we're excited about. So I'm going to ask Ultra to begin by framing the issue.
Great. Well, thank you, Chris. It's great to be here. Nora, Charles, and I are excited. I'm going to share my screen, and just for those of you who are watching, I can't make PowerPoint work and also have my slideshow up. So we're just gonna use my desktop. Can you all see the slide? Okay. So as Chris mentioned, I work in philanthropy, but I have a book that recently came out about a month ago called The Future of Smart. And what I wanted to do was share a little bit of the first part of the book's framing of the issue of transformation in education, but also what that means for transforming other systems, including philanthropy. And then I'll kind of throw it back to Charles and Nora. But the first third of the book, basically says we have lots of conversations right now about trying to change education, but for the most part, I would argue that we're simply tinkering with the factory industrial model and not really kind of pulling back and examining and looking at the values and assumptions that underlie the factory model to really get at a whole different way of thinking about the purpose of education. So the story starts about 500 years ago during a period in Europe when there was this big shift in human beings' understanding of themselves, their relationship to the world, their relationship to one another. So it was the period of the scientific revolution. And what ended up happening was a shift in the way in which people started to view the world, from one that was much more about wholeness, interconnectedness, embodied ways of being in the world, to an approach to living that was about fragmenting information, trying to reduce things down to the smallest units to be able to understand them, to take them out of context and understand them through kind of a scientific method. And a sort of way of being that really privileged conceptual understanding and conceptual knowledge as opposed to embodied ways of being in the world. And what's very interesting is that kind of shift and that two different ways of engaging in the world mirrors the ways that our brains are structured in terms of our two hemispheres. So this is not about right and left hemispheres in terms of I'm left brain, so I'm good at math, or I'm right brained and I'm good at art. It's rather a way of understanding how the brain takes in information and engages with the world. And the right hemisphere is like this big funnel that takes in all sorts of sensory, kind of embodied experiences and information. It passes to the left hemisphere, whose job is to kind of break it down, make it into abstractions, make the knowledge and the information that came in usable. And then ideally, the information gets passed back to the right hemisphere where it gets put back into context. You could think of it as like there's a certain element of wisdom, right? Of being able to use whatever you've learned in a more holistic way. And my argument in the book, which is where I'd love to kind of invite us to start this conversation, is that this Cartesian Newtonian worldview, this left hemispheric way of understanding the world, actually birthed systems, structures, ways of understanding the world and ourselves that kind of that really reflect this worldview, a much more decontextualized, abstracted, disconnected way of understanding. And a holistic indigenous worldview, this more right hemispheric worldview that is embodied, contextualized, and connected, births different kinds of systems. So on this slide, right, it starts even in the sciences. So classical physics versus quantum physics, classical economics versus behavioral economics. But the Cartesian Newtonian worldview also birthed systems that allowed us to enslave people, to colonize people, to have incredibly patriarchal systems, top-down kind of domination of nature, systems that operate kind of from a top-down mentality. And a holistic indigenous worldview creates other kinds of ways of being in the world. So it has us thinking about ecology, conservation, our connectedness to the earth. It thinks about social capitalism. How does our economy work in service of people? So I'm happy to come back to any of these slides, but it also births ways of looking at education that are very different. So the Cartesian Newtonian worldview birthed the factory model of education. A holistic indigenous worldview births what I would call human-centered liberatory educational structures. And you're seeing here a slide that captures some of that. And I'll end by saying that those two worldviews also birth two very different ways of thinking about philanthropy. And our conventional philanthropic systems, right, even as we think about where the money came from, who had control over the money, and who allocates it, and in what ways they allocate it, that kind of sits under conventional philanthropy. And part of the reason that Charles and Nora are here is that there is a different way to approach philanthropy that I think reflects holistic, indigenous, human-centered values, which I would think of as humanistic philanthropy. And that type of philanthropy has very different theory of change, very different ways of thinking about what the purpose of philanthropy is and how we do it every day. So I'm going to pause there because that took up more airspace than I'd like, but I'm going to toss it back as kind of a starting point for our conversation, that as we think about transforming education, transforming philanthropy, transforming systems, if we come at it with a holistic indigenous view, it's going to shift a lot of the ways in which we operate.
And something that what you said evoked in me is the prevalence still in education of behaviorist models of instruction, which are external. It's like, you can't do your own learning. We have to control your learning. And by the way, you can't learn anything complicated until you learn all the simple parts. And then, of course, you no longer care about the complicated thing, and you've forgotten the earlier simple parts by the time you get to the later ones. And it's discouraging that behaviorism really was in its heyday 3/4 of a century ago, and yet it still dominates education because it fits so well with the factory model and with the worldview that you're talking about. So just getting education to the point that you say kids can learn something complicated and they can learn the simple while they're learning the complicated is difficult to get a lot of people to accept.
So I just want to actually add to that, Chris, and thank you, Ulcca, for that setup, because I've been thinking about this. In fact, just had a conversation with a friend yesterday. But I think it's more than behaviorism. I think even if you look at the cognitive models that we have, if you look at the current state of AI, I mean, that goes back to, I think, a book by Dreyfus back in the 70s, what computers can't do or what AI, something like that. I don't remember the title exactly, but basically talking about intelligence as being just a cognitive information processing system rather than it being embodied like in our bodies, in our presence, through the extended phenotype that we create. So I think there's a lot to be said. And I love the sort of the connection that you made between sort of these ways of thinking, of breaking things down, which is incredibly powerful. So we cannot deny the incredible successes that it has brought, but at the same time, almost has made us blind to other possibilities, which I think are maybe as important. So again, thank you for that. And I don't want to go on and on. I could go on and on, but Nora, Charles, how do you see the connection to philanthropy?
No book comes out of a vacuum, right? And so, are there what prompted the book? I mean, what what could you put your finger on and say, well, these were the reasons why this became important enough for me to write about it?
And well, as Nora knows well, I've been thinking about writing this book for probably over a decade. And it was very interesting because I tried to do it through normal larger publishing houses. And I kept hearing, nobody wants a big ideas book, right? When it comes to education, people just want you to tell them what to do with young people. But it seems to me this moment felt like a really important moment for this book because it feels as though we're having all these debates in American society, but I think in communities around the world, around our economic systems, our social systems, our healthcare systems. What are the obligations we owe to one another? And the kind of contours of the debates across different subjects, to me, feel really rooted in this worldview question, right? Am I an individual, or am I an individual in community and relationship with others? And how we answer that question, I think has lots of implications for many of the conversations we're having right now about policy and values. So I tried in the book to sort of talk about education, but in this slightly bigger frame that feels really relevant to this moment.
So Charles and Nora, and I'll start with you, Charles. You're in the wonderful position of being able to invest. And how are you trying to move beyond traditional philanthropy and invest in the kinds of things that would help this vision become real?
Yeah, that's a great question. And as I think about that question, but also just my journey into philanthropy, a lot of it aligns to Ulcca in the book and how you articulated the concept of just tinkering with the current system, or my experience being in education systems, like either you're reformist or a traditionalist or not, or community schools, et cetera, et cetera. There's like these boxes that are created, and throughout it all, there's some great work, and there's some work that needs to be tinkered with, some work that needs to be changed. But overall, at the core, we have to really begin to think about how do we radically transform and support a system differently. And when I think about philanthropy and moving into this work here, one, meeting Nora, having coffee with her and talking around the approach that Wend is thinking through in terms of philanthropy, it just struck a nerve in me, being on the other side of like trying to find dollars on the programmatic side, looking for dollars, looking for outcomes, and spending a countless amount of time on my team and my staff to find outcomes that may not be there or may be there, or we're searching for it on a prescribed approach, that's the funders wanted in some cases. That wasn't really human centered, right? It was for me human dependent on us, like moving away from the work and actually trying to fill out forms and things to get the dollars that we truly needed. So as I think about just adding to that, just the concept of investing in people is something that's been driving home. And when we think about that and people at the center of how we provide funding and provide partnership, that's something that we begin to start wrestling with, rather than invest in just programs or invest in just outputs, right? But you really sit down and take opportunities to listen, hear, and consult and provide guidance. And sometimes it leads to funding, but sometimes it leads to just a stronger partnership that may lead to funding in the near future. But that's when I think about the holistic human-centered piece of like, that's where we start. Like, let's talk about people and how do we work with you as a leader of an organization. What do you think, Nora?
Yeah, I'll pop in because Wend is a social impact fund that our philosophy is being human-centered. Our philosophy is about using nature as our guide. We talk about how can we human better. We use human as a verb. How can we human better? And then through the trust in human beings, how can we make the world a better place? So we believe strongly that those who are most impacted by whatever social injustice we're trying to address are those who actually know what the root cause of the issue is. They know what the barriers are, and what they need are resources. And resources are sometimes financial, but the other resources, to Charles's point, sometimes it's access. We have access that many community-based organizations don't. We believe in systems change from the bottom up and the top down. Ulcca and Charles and I had this conversation about, we believe strongly, again, that those who are most impacted know the issue best, and they're the ones best positioned to actually be the solution makers. And so we believe that we have to lift the voices of community, give them access, give them resources, and still work with policymakers and influencers at the top, because they are the ones who are going to make the decisions. And then it's kind of like, then in the middle, we'll hope to see the spread of systems change. So we consider ourselves a systems change organization. But we really believe in going to the communities, making sure that those within the communities have the voice. So when we work with community-based organizations, we're really conscious of who's on their boards, who's in the leadership positions, who are they listening to, who's involved in their own decision making. And so this idea of radical inclusion that Ulcca brought up is exactly what we believe as well, this idea of radical inclusion of those most impacted.
And I can add just quickly to Nora, and we talked, so the radical inclusion external, but then the internal Wend, it's radically inclusive in terms of how our org structure is set up, where there's not hierarchy within Wend. It's really advice groups, conversations, talking with colleagues around how do we support each other in a social emotional aspect, but also our budgets. How do we begin to partner closer in a way that should be reflective of how we work in the field? And that's a big eye opener for me as I moved into philanthropy, where I know it's not sector norm to run an organization that way.
So I got a question for you. Thanks, you guys, for the points. If you look at education philanthropy over the past several decades, you would probably see the largest chunk of money have been misinvested, from the Gates Foundation to to the Wharton Foundation, so all of them, to the Walmart, whatever they've been doing, because they've all been used to support a system view of education, which I think Ulcca is actually quite against about. The system view of education is the dystopia view that Ulcca would argue that test scores, Common Core, standards, teacher retraining, all of those things. And so when you think about investment in communities, I think what is interesting is that how do you get the community, again, communities can be very divided, can have different views, can have very different perspectives, especially in today's America. I'm just wondering how Charles, Laura, Nora, or Ulcca, whoever you want to say this, is to say, how do you actually support voices of the future that may be very small voice today? Because today, not the mainstream voice is leading. Actually, the four of us sitting here as co-hosts, we have no other place to talk. So we hang out amongst ourselves. That's why we're here, because we might represent the future, but we haven't sought funding from anybody either. But I was just curious to say, from your perspective, how do we support voices of the future, not voices of the powerful today?
Yeah, I mean, I can.
Yeah. You go first, then I'll jump on yours.
Okay. Yeah, that's a lot. That's a great question. One, it takes time. So really taking time to listen, and it's not listening for the loudest voice in the community, but those who are holding the social emotional connectivity of the community. And to do that, it's a series of questions, interviewing and conversations with key stakeholders and key people in the community. And we've all been there, where if you go into a community and you hear a certain name a number of times, right, from different people, oh, that's the person that I need to talk to, right? Because they are often maybe not on a YouTube or a webinar right now, but they're actually working and providing help in the community right now. And so they may not have the time, but that's a part of it. And the other part is something I value about the org we work with and work for, is that it's not enough just to ask questions, but we're able to provide seed funding. And one of the big pieces that Nora and I actually talked around the other day around substantial funding makes a difference to those who don't have the dollars and they have these ideas that they want to lift. Because as we begin to think about change, you can't change with programs that don't have the support that can make quality programs, right? Organizations make quality organizations. And so that's the approach we've been really thinking about is, how do we listen, how do we find time, and how do we truly invest and support those who need support. And sometimes the ideas may be raw. I mean, they may not be the most polished, fleshed out, but as you know the person in an org, you begin to understand, oh, you just need you need dollars, but you need additional help, maybe with this, but that's the human part of it. So sorry.
If I can just say too, and I know Punya and Kurt and Chris, you want to jump in here, but part of it to me is having the distinction, right? And understanding that so much of what we've been trying to do has actually been inside the same box. So it has been reforming. I think people don't fully have an understanding of the distinction between reforming and transforming. So certainly the book was trying to lay out that distinction, because I think if you don't have it, you kind of smush everything together and think that you're making a difference when you're not. But I think once you have the distinction, to Charles's point, kind of going in, listening, and from a philanthropic standpoint, I would say being intentional about how you're putting your dollars. So there may be a certain amount of money that needs to be about immediate programmatic support and is a little bit more about maintaining the status quo or making it better. And then there's a separate pot of money that you put into transformational work that is a long time horizon. It's patient capital. It's capital that allows people to kind of be a little bit more emergent, be more process focused, maybe, not do exactly the right thing, but it's the R&D engine. And so I think, from a philanthropic standpoint, I think being clear that you're going to do both of those things is important, and then doing them differently, right? Taking a much more emergent relational approach to the transformative work, even though you might not be doing that in the majority of your docket.
Okay, and I'll just pop in real quick. So we are not delusional at Wend. We don't use the language of funder and grantee. We use the language of partners, but again, we're not delusional. We get it that there's a power dynamic there. There will always be a power dynamic, but we're hugely relational internally and externally. And so the idea of not being prescriptive and instead working with partners to say, how are you going to measure success? It's not our metrics of success. It's not the number of students you serve, the percentage of kids who are getting whatever test score. It's really like, what are you trying to do and how are you going to measure success? And that's what we work with them on. That's how we measure the impact, is really on what our partner organizations are trying to do. So that relational piece is huge. And then the other idea is this idea that funding is only one aspect of the resources we can bring to a partnership. When I said earlier, we have access that other community organizations don't. We have relationships. We have other partners who have gone through similar things that we do a lot of connecting of our partner to partner who are working in the same youth development, youth voice, community-based systems change work. And so we can do that. And then the other thing about us is we think that the greatest outcome that our organizations can achieve is learning. And so we talk to them about, what are you learning? What went wrong? What went right? So this idea of building trust with partners, they tend to be very vulnerable with us. Like, boy, Houston, we have a problem. This didn't work. And we see that as good. Like, not everything's going to work. Don't take that as a failure. Instead, what did you learn? How did you pivot? Who did you talk to? What do you need? And so I really believe there is a different way of building relationships instead of king making, right? To your point, Young, the king making that a lot of, especially big philanthropists and foundations do, where we give money to the same organizations over and over who are trying to go to the influencers and the policymakers instead of listening to the people who are really impacted.
Punya?
Sure, thank you. And this is wonderful to hear the way that you guys are thinking and approaching this. But I'm also, I also hear from other people who are funding in education, and they sort of use the same language. They always talk about, we are participatory, we'll listen. So that's part of the lingua franca, so to speak, in that space now, where irrespective of whatever you are doing. So I had a question about, can you give us some examples of projects or groups that you're working with where I think that will help me, and I think our viewers understand how exactly is this different? Because one can talk that talk, but what does it actually mean in that space? And second, and this I'll make a point from a group that I work with in India, the Azim Premji Foundation. And amazing group of people, and they've been working in some parts of India for literally 10 years before they felt the needle move even a little bit. That if you want to truly create change, I mean, the person who leads it is this amazing guy who had no background in education, came from theater, but brought a certain way of doing the work, but it still took 10 years before they could see any substantial. So how are you seeing, because that is a kind of investment which many investment spaces don't, they think 2 years, 3 years, then either you cut your losses or you declare victory and then you go on to the next project. So this is a long question, so 2 parts. One, can you give us some examples? And second, how long term are you thinking of these things? Because these things don't happen, they take time.
Right. So I can answer that. So I've been with Wend for almost 5 years, and there were several different organizations that at the very beginning of this work, we were just really doing almost like a feasibility study, a landscape analysis of who's out there, what's going on in learner-centered social emotional learning, thinking differently about education, where education is not 8 to 4 within the walls of a school, but instead learning happens everywhere all the time. Who's out there and who's doing the work? So we sort of cast a pretty broad net. That's when I first met Ulcca, and we actually did a listening tour and talked about what is it that parents want from education? What is it that they expect and aspire for their kids when their kids are young adults? And so we did a lot of listening at that time. We have a strong propensity toward the Montessori model, for instance, especially in early education, in building confidence and independence and really following the child and the development of the child. And so we started learning a lot about those, and then actually also realized that there are policy barriers in place for a learner-centered educational model such as Montessori. So then we started trying to connect the dots within the Montessori world of who is doing what. And so helped to seed a Montessori public policy initiative. There's another organization called the National Center for Montessori in the public sector. So trying to kind of develop the ecosystem around an issue that we're interested in. Charles is actually involved in some really interesting youth success work, youth development, youth success, youth voice work in Colorado. So maybe you could speak a little to that. And then just the idea that we do multi-year investments. I actually had somebody, and I can't remember where he was from, who used the language of "my God" investments. And because the response he got from leaders when they issued these kinds of grants was "my God" in their multi-year general operating dollars. My God. And so we give general operating dollars. We believe that, there are those funders who are only going to fund project-based or certain different strands of work. We'll give general operating dollars. We do some multi-year. Otherwise, we're in it. We just let them know, like, we're in it for the long haul, and we take Wend as a verb. Like it's a meaningful word to us to have the name Wend Collective, because Wend is a verb, and we believe in wending with our partners. So we are we understand that these systems that are baked in took a very long time to get this way, and the changes to these systems are not going to happen overnight. And so we have to be committed partners in this work, and then we try to bring other funders into the work along with us. We also belong to the Grant Makers for Thriving Youth, which is another collaborative funding model that's all dedicated to social emotional learning, equity, and justice in education. And so we belong to different organizations like that as well. Charles, if you want to speak a little to the youth work.
Yeah, that's a great point. And something that was said around the language, a lot of people are using the language in philanthropy. And I truly believe that organizations that we partner with in philanthropy are taking those efforts to really live out the language and the values. Now, like Nora said, it's it's taken longer, but the idea of listening and hearing a community and trying to be equitable access, every person I've met with or been a part of these conversations locally and nationally that provides funding are really trying, right? Internally and externally, and they're having different challenges and conversations around how do you change a system in funding, and that's happening. Are we there yet? Not yet, but I can say like that's a surprising thing that coming into philanthropy, I didn't realize how much of a like an effort it is from program officers, senior program, whatever title they may be, within how much of a rally cry across the nation people are really trying to make this shift. As far as Colorado, and doing and being listening and being a part of the community, and something that was in Olga's book and on the slide around this concept of co-creating, which I think at glance you say, okay, yeah, that sounds good. But for us, it's been around like really co-creating, starting with an initial idea. There's a couple of organizations that when I got hired to Wend, we started initial conversations around they're just launching. And when I say launch, they're new organizations trying to just figure out their footprint. And there's one where a year ago we were chatting and talking to the org leader about an app, right? You want to do an app. And I say, hey, let's just stay in touch. As that morph, let's continue to talk. 6 months later, check in, say, hey, Charles, the app is not a good idea, but there's still this need around youth, right? Around undocumented youth, helping them find ways to citizenship, right? And I said, okay, let's keep talking. What does your budget look like? And he said, well, I don't have a solid budget yet, but I'm just trying to work on it, and I'm getting the staff, and okay, another 6 months, right? And then finally they're at a place to say, okay, here's where we want to go. There's some legislation that's changed. There's some needs I'm continuing to hear. We're not going to do the app and we're not going to do this, but here's where we want to go. And so that's where, as an organization, I'm able to go in and say, hey, let's provide some spark funding to help you get over that hump and begin to deepen these things that you're looking at. So that's one example. Another example is the effort around working with a couple college presidents here around this concept of like, how do we wrestle with helping our workforce develop social capital? And again, this is an idea that's beginning to morph, and this is the co-creation of really being a listener, not being prescriptive around here's what I think you should do in terms of outputs and outcomes. But rather the question is like, what are you currently doing within your universities that are building towards this so that we can know, and work together that this is something that's not going to be a short-term fix, and we're really addressing the root cause. And so this is a more conversation of like, what is the root cause? And my role is like, who else within this education ecosystem we could bring a part of these conversations that it help funding or help connect or help provide research. But that's a long answer, but the idea is like co-creating, it's going to take time. And we're clear around, we don't have an application where we do all call and you fill out the application. It really is around these connections and conversations that lead to different projects.
Thank you.
I really like the fact that you're doing the opposite of the deficit model that pervades systems change, education, and philanthropy right now. And when I've interacted with more traditional philanthropy groups and tried to point out that they had a deficit model, they're kind of rushing in to fix people that they see as broken. There's something in the answer that I get that is a kind of blaming the victim. Well, these folks couldn't fix it themselves. That's why they're in this bad position. And that's why we had to we have to rescue them, as opposed to saying, these folks are where they are because there's an oppressive system that surrounds them that has systematically marginalized them. And yet the seeds of their evolution are internal to them. They're not external with you. So I really like this. Bob Nelson, who's one of our regular viewers, raises a question about politics. And as you know, although philanthropy piously says that it's distinct from politics, that is far from the case for many groups that label themselves as philanthropic. And we also know that politics has a way of, trying to skew investments to match particular ideologies. I also, and I don't want to put you on the spot, Ulcca, but I love Grantmakers for Education. I think it's a terrific association. They're very thoughtful in my interactions with them, and I have colleagues like Jim Honan who work with them a lot. But this has got to be a difficult conversation, I would think, within Grantmakers for Education about these different models for philanthropy. So I'm curious about how you see politics and how you see kind of the evolution of the philanthropic community itself is playing out in this situation.
Yeah, who wants to take that? I mean, the politics question, I think it is a really interesting one. The first thing I would say, Bob, is you asked, like, how do you make progress at scale? And I don't love the word scale. Right? Scale to me is very much in that old kind of mechanistic model of like some building and you want it big and you want it to be. I think of spread, which to me is much more ecological and sort of organic. And so how is it that we seed different ways of doing things in different places, knowing that they might look different in different contexts, different communities, and sort of trust that they're gonna sort of like to morph and come together in sort of meaningful ways. But it's not a desire to kind of take something and then just kind of impose it willy-nilly on everything. And so I think, at least to me, it's helpful, this different way of doing philanthropy, right? I think of fractals. I work with fractals a lot. There is a different way of being in the work. There is a different way of being in relationship to both the work and the people that you're working with. There is a sense, like in the same way that human-centered education says a child has potential, and our job is to help that potential be unfolded. And the whole design of the system is based on relationships and on experiences that allow that unique potential to unfold. To me, there is something about the next level up of a system, right? An organization that sees all the people in the organization that way and designs itself to untap the potential of the people in that community. And in the same way, I think this approach to philanthropy, to your point about not being deficit-based, says inside this community, there are the people who have the solutions and have the capacity to do something and build something different. And so how do we, as philanthropists, come in and sort of support them and give them the support over time with access, social capital, et cetera, that they need. So it's this really consistent set of values and ways of being that I think make up this work. And, I think philanthropists are at this moment, right? You've got decolonizing wealth. You've got a lot of kind of pushing back from the beginnings of where did people get their money, and in what ways is there a need to kind of be really thoughtful and upfront about the fact that a lot of money in philanthropy was gotten in ways that are problematic and on the backs of kind of free labor, all the way to how are organizations set up. And it is hard for them to change, particularly some of the larger organizations. But I do think in good faith, people are trying to sort of have these conversations and understand that you have to start with yourself. So you really have to kind of like think about yourself. What is your power? What is your role? How is it uncomfortable to change that as an individual, as an organization? And that's not a quick thing. So I think in the same way that we would say that the work itself in the world takes time, I think in philanthropic institutions, that's true as well.
Kurt.
I'll jump in on that idea of the question, Bob's question about the politics. And I think for us, one is that we never pretend to speak for a community. It's not our work, right? It's the work of the community. And so I think when we talked earlier about like that idea of systems change from the bottom up, but also recognizing that top level of the systems changers, the politicians and the influencers and things like that. I think when we think about systems change from the bottom up, it's galvanizing the community and lifting the voices of community and building a concerted a concerted group within communities that can be made up of different organizations and different players at the community level. And then what's the next level? What do they say? All politics is local. What's the next level that they can influence? So when we think about a school, a district, a state of education, right? So how do parents influence the schools that their children attend? How does that look? That's school board elections, that's leadership, that's working with the classroom. It's building a coalition of the parents to change the school, to build a coalition of the schools to change the district, a coalition of districts to push up the state. So it's kind of that idea of the groundswell of support. And then recognizing that politicians get elected. And so how do we work with communities? Again, not us influencing but making sure that communities have the information that they need and that they have the resources that they need to address the issues that they're trying to address in the community.
I also think when you're not trying to kind of say that you're going to change the entire system all at once. So like, you know, the innovation, the change adoption curve, the innovation curve, like you start with the coalition of the willing. So you find the people who are doing the work, who want to do the work, who want to be involved in the work. I think this idea of whether it's innovation zones or pilots, but I think of it as like, how do you carve out some research and development space in public systems or in spaces where you've got to be changing kind of systems? How do you carve out some room and allow people some freedom and flexibility from the constraints that currently tie them to the existing system, give them time, but because it's small, it doesn't yet seem like a threat to the entire system. And so I think there's a little bit more room to for people to kind of do something new. And I think the nature of innovation is that once you have something new and other people start to see it, there's a question of like, hey, what's that? And you get the next group over, right? The early adopters. And you slowly and kind of gradually have something new emerge, as opposed to trying to make some big case and be like, we're gonna, overturn the entire education system. That's gonna get you into politics. But I think there are ways to kind of do the work that don't have to be quite as political because they're not as threatening.
My late colleague Clay Christensen certainly was an advocate of disruptive change that has the characteristics you describe. Kurt?
Yeah. Thanks, Chris. Thanks, everyone. I have kind of a two-part observation, and I'm going to pose a question to all three of you to answer. So I want to, and you can pass on answering it too. We're all kind of professors in the educational technology field somehow, but not fully. We're foot and fingers in different things. But 16 years ago, when I was in educational psychology, and I was kicked out when the learning science people came along, and they had the money. They had the money and the tenure lines. They could do what they wanted, and that's kind of a problem with the field somewhat. And I double majored in human learning and human development, but I always told people I couldn't study the human development side because those things take too long, and you can't get tenure for that. And once I get tenure, then I can look at that. But funding from sources like yours enables people to explore questions that they couldn't previously, that they had to put on the back burner and had to watch the time go by and the clocks, the years scroll on by until they, were situated in a place where they could do it. And then they might not have funding to do it and so forth. And so, if someone wants to comment on that, but it's the second part that I really would want you all to comment on, and that is you're in a unique space, and people are going to be watching the show who are young people within the field. A lot of professors in our field are assigning these episodes, including myself, including Chris, including many others that we've run into. And so, what would you say to a young person, a graduate, undergraduate student, or maybe a young professional in the field, of how would one join in to your cause? What kind of resources are you tapping into or reading or watching so that your antennas are up, and what are those antennas honing in on? So I'm curious to hear how you're keeping up, or what the field is in terms of the outlets, the dissemination outlets, the conferences, the people, all that. And so, it's something that I can learn from, and I'm sure anyone watching this later can learn from.
And Kurt, could I ask if you're asking about what's happening in the field of kind of transforming education or transforming philanthropy, or both? Education.
But if you want to answer about transforming philanthropy, by all means. But I'm thinking about, the social emotional side, that you're focusing in on, the humanistic side that you're focusing in on.
I mean, I probably wouldn't be a good author if I didn't say you should read my book. But
We got it.
So,
Ulcca, you beat me to it. I was just going to say, well, first of all, you should read The Future of Smart.
Thank
but
you,
it's
Nora.
true.
I appreciate that. It's a weird thing. Once you become an author, like that has to make its way into every single conversation. But I say that not in jest. Like, I wrote the book because I had something to say, which I think is important. I tried to distill things that are very complex into a way that feels accessible. So yes, that would be one. I think there are lots of, and in the book I do talk about certain sort of models like Montessori, like Steiner Waldorf, like expeditionary learning, like big picture learning. So there are a lot of networks that I think operate more on this human-centered kind of liberatory approach to education. I think there are lots of one-offs. I would argue that in almost every community, there is a school like this. So in Denver, it's the Logan School, but everyone knows it. It's the kind of progressive, project-based school. Oftentimes it's a gifted school. More often than not, it's a private school or independent, because it's very hard for these schools to operate in the public system, in part because of accountability and grade level standards, that type of thing. So I'll let Nora and Charles, you jump in as well. Kurt, you're muted.
Yeah, Kurt, you're muted.
I was going to say, here it's Harmony School.
Yeah. Well, I think I agree, and I think that for me, I get a lot of energy. I was a teacher and a principal for 30 years. And so I get my energy from watching what's going on with children, right? And what's going on with youth. And so Ulcca actually also used to work with an organization that we support called Education Reimagined, that has been doing a lot of work over the last several years in looking at actual Pioneer Lab schools and districts across the country that really are trying to develop learner-centered practices within individual schools, within systems, within districts, and things like that. So I think this synergy of learning from all of these different organizations, that's one organization that I think has a lot of resources to share and a lot of knowledge and spread. The other one is actually our colleagues at the Grantmakers for Thriving Youth. It is exactly what we talk about in every one of our calls, and people are bringing in different resources into our conversations as grant makers. The equity focuses now, I guess I will just say there are so many resources now and so many different groups who are studying equity and learner-centered education. But I think those are ones where I would start.
So I'll just double click on what I was going to mention, the very similar organizations. I think the other piece is when you think about like ed technology, I love that you're in the ed tech world, because one of my prior work was to work with micro credentials, and that kind of opened my eyes to the opportunities to provide equity for more youth, right, in a way that you can digitize or show credentials. And so one of the spaces is, like in Aurora Public Schools, they have this organization called Versus. They do a digital badge webinar convening across the United States. And so I'm able to tap into that, or international as well, and listen to the micro credentials conversation, because that leads into conversations around pathways, conversations around the future of work. And then the other piece, just honestly as well, is like my daughter, she's in 12, she's a 7th grader. And as I listen and talk with her around her digital needs and understanding what's happening with her school, that's one way I'm able to really stay a little more current around, okay, it's an evolution of some things that are happening outside of what I grew up with, or even when I worked in a school system. Things are changing so fast, especially even with last year with COVID. So there's a couple of things that I've been paying attention to.
So they
Yeah.
well, my question can go any different direction. I'm just going to pick one because I have actually spoken at the Grant Makers in Education conference, and also I spoke to a network of STEAM and STEM founders. I also am on the board of several, kind of foundations who gives money to others. I know how hard you guys work. I know how difficult it is, and so this question is not for particularly with the Wend Collective, but I would just go back to Ulcca. I'm sure in Ulcca in your book, I have not read it, but I want to say from what you shared, you would like to argue that the current education systems don't produce the students we need. So that is a problem. You will say, yeah, that's right.
Yes.
So and anything you want to use, any money you invest in supporting the education system we have today is in essence is to suppress our children a lot more. Charles, you have a 12th graders. In many ways, they're all been deprived of the opportunity to become themselves, to become a human being, to become a leader in that way. And so, as you know, foundations needs to, tends to support different kind of work. Some support existing work, like Zuckerberg, the New Jersey work, which, never worked. But, you see a lot of people trying to do different things. So I'm just really curious. By the way, I want to convince you, you should invest in Chris Didi, who has good ideas. But anyway, but my point is this: where do you see people investing in impossibilities? That is the system the politics does not support. That is schools don't exist. For example, Nora, when you talk about communities, we're having new communities without a location. That's global. We have global schools, global connections, but they have a mission, they have connections. So where do you see the efforts going? Anyone paying attention to the impossible or the unimaginable, that beyond the system?
And you mean that in a positive way? So
yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, you can create
you're investing
things.
in something that is the future of it, not you're investing in something that's impossible and it's never going to work. Okay.
Oh, well, no, there are people who invest in that, like Elon Musk, but you guys can do something, I'm thinking about positive, educational, from educational angle, because today, whenever we talk about community, we're talking about location based, but there can be some new possibilities, new ways. And like Kurt was saying, who is going to cultivate that? We don't have the money. Government is not going to cultivate that. We need the foundations, the philanthropists.
I mean, I will say, I think about Workspace, which was a sort of learning co-op in Connecticut. And during the pandemic, they basically did Workspace Sky, which was an effort to really think about how do you put resources in the cloud, allow them to be accessible. How are you trying to create communities across the globe of people who might be interested in kind of learning from and with each other? You have a new initiative called Mosaic, which is trying to be a resource for parents who want to do self-directed education, kind of, homeschooling, but again, to connect them with resources, to connect them with folks outside of their community so that they can have a community of like-minded people to raise their kids. So those are a couple. Nora, Charles, I'm sure you.
Yeah. Charles, what's the name of the one that actually started in Colorado and it's looking at out of system? Okay,
Preschool Colorado?
No, the funding.
Oh.
The funding group. That's, I don't know, but they're coming, these funding groups that are looking at out of system kinds of learning. I think it's happening. I would argue, Young, really, that the communities you're talking about that are the global communities, the pandemic has taught us nothing but there are great communities that can be built virtually, right? It's happening for sure. And then I would ask the question, so who is starting them? How are they being generated? Because I think those are the questions we would ask is where is it coming from? Is it generating from those people who want it to be used? Or is it, again, a prescriptive kind of an, out in look at what works and what doesn't work? Because we certainly experiment. We're pretty small, actually, as a fund. We don't have, we don't have a lot of money to seed some of the bigger endeavors. That said, I think it's happening, and I think they're out there. And I think I am a firm believer that out of crisis comes opportunity. And I think the pandemic has shown us that there was no such thing as normal before, and we're certainly not going back to whatever that was.
Yeah.
And so,
yeah.
Okay.
And Vela Fund, sorry, that's one. I mean, Vela is doing some interesting stuff where they've tried to do grants, and they range from like $5,000 to $25,000 to $200,000. But it's really very few strings attached, very low bar to kind of get funding. They're trying to distribute it in different kinds of communities, but everything is kind of community-based, community-led to kind of see what emerges, and they're trying to be really thoughtful about seeing what happens, following them. Kind of, how should that influence their next round of funding? So I think they're really trying to.
Well, another area I just want to say that Ulcca, maybe you can advocate this, is I would love to have people directly fund teachers and students. A student can apply for $200 or $50. That actually can be globally. I try to put that idea into the National Educational Technology Plan, but they rejected my idea. So forget about it. Nobody.
We
wants
actually
to
support an organization, Young, that does that.
What's that?
Mike, we support an organization that actually does that. Gives little micro grants of $500 to students, and they create little projects in their communities, their own geographic.
Is that national? Is that organization?
It is.
National?
It's called Grip Tape.
Yeah.
Okay.
So,
The founders.
Okay, so we're a little short on time, and I know that Punya has a point that he wants to raise, and then I'll jump in to thank you and plug the next week's episode.
Can I jump in really quick on this last point around community? It's around one of the challenges, well, what we do, and we intentionally have done, I say with our Wendication support at Wend, is really focus on the community and place-based funding. So the proximity to community makes the difference. And I know there's always that draw to try to get national collaborative. But when you talk to community members, they say, well, national sounds amazing, but I need to work with my local nonprofit and work together. How can we change this in this city? And so we try to figure out what's the need, how do we bring the people that we're working with in terms of partnerships, how to help them connect differently. And then if there's something sparks out of that, then that's where we may want to do more of the funding as a part of that. Sorry.
So I'll be quick. So one of the challenges of working within communities is that, so we were working with these schools around building what you call a portrait of a graduate, right? So that you can then use that as the North Star compass, so on. But one of the challenges is that the communities themselves may not be aware and sensitive to broader trends, whether it's around technology or jobs and so on. And so part of the thing is, how do you bring those sort of this bigger trends, that whether it's, I'm listening to this podcast on Bitcoin, I'm trying to figure out what that means for everybody, right? And you look at the idea of the metaverse. And so there are all these things bubbling, and who the heck knows which ones are going to play out and which ones are going to not. But you still have to be factoring those in as you think about how you're preparing the next generation. So I would just love, quickly, given time, what your thoughts on when you're talking to the community, like, you're listening to them, but at some point you also want to be able to broaden the conversation. How does that sort of work out?
So I'll just say, these human-centered schools have existed forever, and they've always been countercultural. I would say for the first time, what they produce and what the world needs in terms of a world where you're going to have non-biological intelligence and technology, you're going to have things changing at a rate and in a pace that we can't fathom. And no matter how much we try and read the current trends of what's happening, the reality is that they're probably going to be outdated in a couple of years anyway. And so you need young people who know how to learn, who are actually curious, have a sense of kind of purpose in themselves to kind of like drive, learn, grow. I think you need people with deeply human capabilities, right? And those things I think are fairly constant, regardless of what some of the specific trends are. And I think, it is a really important conversation to have with parents. I think this generation of parents is probably the first one where before the safest thing to do was give your child what worked for you. But I actually think if you do that for your children now, right, the education most of us have, you're putting them on a path that's kind of crumbling towards them because it's not going to exist. And I think that's a conversation we need to be having, you know, in communities with families. And it is deeply uncomfortable. And yet, right, this is the reality of the world our kids are going to inherit. And
to add to that, that's what we support as well, the multi-generational approach, from the sixth grader with this amazing idea of like, why doesn't paint dry faster, right? Like, what do you mean by that? And what does that look like in the near future? But then also thinking through this gap of recent college grads that are between 23 and 30 years old, because their perspective is going to be different from someone who graduated 4 years ago, right? And versus someone who's about to graduate in the next 3 years. And so having this multi-generation that way as well is something to think about.
Well, the hour has flown by, and we are at a point where we have to wrap up. I want to thank the three of you for just a wonderful conversation, and for the big picture thinking that you're doing, thinking globally, acting locally. It's good formula, definitely. Next week, episode 80. The hosts are going to reflect, and we have a lot to reflect on based on the last few episodes. Blended learning, designing the next education workforce, what the education that we need, which also was a conversation that was big picture and transformational. So we hope that you'll join us next week.